Well, hello, everybody, and thank you very much to Equinet for inviting me to join you today or this morning for a fantastic session. You are really lucky to listen to Raja and hear the engineering and technical explanation for what we're about to talk about in a bit more detail. I want to put up this slide first, which you'll see in the top right-hand corner is the picture of Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum. And in January 2016, this is what he said: "We stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale, scope, and complexity, the transformation will be unlike anything humankind has experienced before. The response to it must be integrated and comprehensive, involving all stakeholders of the global polity, from the public and private sectors to academia and civil society." And he was talking about the potential coming from increased computing power and systems such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the impact that it was going to have on us. And you will have heard from, or begun to understand from what Raja was telling you, just why Klaus Schwab was saying this some 5 years ago, and giving the world this extraordinary warning that we really have to engage with what this all means for us. And since then, AI systems have really engaged in almost every different part of our life. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. But first, just to set the scene, and to tell you, as regulators in your countries, as national equality bodies, that you can act to make a difference. And you can engage with what Klaus Schwab was saying. You are part of civil society, and you have a really major role to play in dealing with the issues that we have begun to identify. So let's talk a bit more about that. Well, first of all, if you didn't know it, artificial intelligence systems and automated decision-making are operating across Europe and affecting everyone, literally everyone. We'll talk a bit more about that, no doubt, during the morning and on the 30th as well. But anybody who's in any doubt about that, let me just give you an example. For instance, in the summer during the pandemic, AI systems were used in different parts of the world to predict education grades. They were being used to control where people were, whether they were working at home. They were being used to regulate the proper distribution of vaccines and so on, a whole range of different places where they were being used. And they have a significant scope to affect people in a discriminatory way. Raja's told you a little bit about the engineering problems that can lead to that. And you can see that that is a real potential problem. The next thing is, so far, there's been relatively little litigation with few significant judgments. We can mention a few. Some of you will have read about Siri and Parkour and Uber, and we will listen to a few more, I hope, later on this morning. But there isn't a big body of case law. Really just we stand on the threshold, I think, of more litigation. We also know that they have a big impact on Article 8 rights, on privacy, and they're very closely connected with data protection rights as well. So that's the scene. Just a quick word about some of the key concepts that we'll need to be talking about today. Algorithms, the instructions, sorry, it's lost that one, the instructions to the machine. That has now been really explained, I think, quite very well with the slides from Raja. Machine learning, the process of extracting correlations. The ADM, decisions or conclusions reached effectively without any direct human involvement. Engineers sometimes discuss what is and what isn't an ADM decision, because sometimes these systems do have an individual between the way they make decisions and the way those decisions are operated, which might mean that a human can override them, but often humans feel disempowered to question a decision that is made by a computer, that there is a correlation between a face and a list of faces, for instance, or something of that kind. So there's ADM, which is technically ADM in the sense that the machine makes the decision, and there's a different kind of ADM when effectively the human doesn't have full and proper involvement. And then there are issues related to profiling, the automated processing of personal data, to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to a natural person. And this could relate to economic situation, health, personal preferences, interests, reliability, behavior, location, or movements. Classic examples of that are the systems that lie behind the advertising that you get when you go online. If you get automated advertising showing you that they think you should buy this book or try this kind of clothes or take this holiday, there will have been some profiling that has taken place. So these are the kinds of key concepts that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about these issues. Okay, so let's just think a bit about machines and discrimination and how AI systems can work. There really are a number of different things to think through here. And since you are all members of national equality bodies, it's a question of bringing your day-to-day knowledge about discrimination law to work in this particular field. Obviously, a system could be directly discriminatory. It could be designed in such and such a way to exclude women or men. Systems have been known, for instance, to exclude advertising of certain products for men, or to do it the other way around for women, for instance. You can get into the situation of statistics and discrimination, and that will ordinarily involve some connection with indirect discrimination. I'm just jumping ahead one level. These systems can be harassing. There's a classic example, for instance, in which Google Images identified black faces as being faces of gorillas, which was highly harassing for individuals. And there can be other examples of harassment. They can be indirectly discriminatory, where they operate in a way which creates a practice which, although not totally excluding people with a particular protected characteristic, nonetheless have principally that impact, and then questions of justification will arise. And very often, they will fail to make reasonable adjustments. the whole range of points at which disability rights and AI systems engage is very large indeed. As you have heard from Raja, these systems work on a classification basis, and of course, disabilities are very difficult to classify appropriately. The whole statutory obligation in European law to make reasonable adjustments for disabled persons, persons with disabilities, is connected to the individuality of that particular person's disability in a particular context. And machines are really poor at addressing that because they find it, partly because it won't be in the training data that's used, and partly also because the attempt to classify may be completely inappropriate. We also need to think a little bit about public obligations in relation to equality. And these systems are very often being used now to save money, to decide on the distribution of social advantages, and so on. So states which have been throwing money hand over fist to keep businesses alive during the pandemic are looking to cut costs. And often these systems, for instance, are being used in the distribution of social advantages. We have an example in the UK, which I've just been writing about, where self-employed people were entitled to a grant and during the pandemic, and the grant was calculated on their earnings during the previous 3 years. The system was fully automated and made no allowances for people who had been on pregnant or on maternity leave during those 3 years, and therefore their earnings had been diminished. And it's been argued, and we believe completely wrongly, that because the pandemic was such an urgency, that there was a justification to have a fully automated system. We think that that is wholly disproportionate, but it's an issue we need to think through. Then there's this issue of transparency, the black box, which Raja's spoken a little bit about. And then finally, a really significant point, which we need to think about, which is trust. There are many different surveys that have been carried out across Europe about the degree to which these systems are trusted. Now, in some contexts, there is a high degree of trust, but in many situations, they're not trusted at all. And this can be an impediment, a barrier to the proper rollout of the systems. So as equality bodies, when we're thinking about these issues, we need to think how we can promote appropriate trust, but also where trust is lacking and appropriately not present, and what the implications are. So important issues for us in our discussions. So let's have a little think about how discrimination can occur. Some fairly obvious issues: biased input, that's to say original training data, which is not reflective of the population at large. Systems can have biased machine learning. There can be bad data collection systems about input data, and there can be poor or no human interaction. And how to deal with it? We need to think through at least 4 key points. Raja's talked about transparency. I'm sorry, I've misspelt that. There's an S missing from it, transparency. And this is a word that you'll hear used a great deal. It's discussed by the high-level working group. It's in many of the ethical principles. But we've put a word in above that, which we are talking about, that's Steve Masters and I, and much more in this context, and it's observability. Because one of the major problems about transparency is not just understanding how a system works, but knowing in the first place that you have been subject to an AI system. Many people simply don't observe the way these systems operate in relation to them. And I'll give you a very simple example of that. If any of you have children or family members who have left education and have been trying to get into work, they may well have put their CVs, their curriculum vitae, onto the web and have been waiting for employers to come along and scrape the web to offer them the opportunity for an interview. They simply will not observe how those employers have considered that they should shortlist people or reject them. They simply won't know. There are many other ways in which we do not observe how this is happening. For instance, we barely observe the way in which facial recognition technology is used in city centres, how that may have allowed us to go one way or another. So there's a key point here that equality bodies need to be aware of, which is, where are systems being used, and do we actually know the people who are being affected by them? Do we know if they are being affected? And then we come on to transparency, understanding how they work, and then thinking through what is the rule of law, and then can the legal system actually operate to deal with that? Now, the rule of law is obviously the set of regulations that we have in discrimination law, in human rights law, in data protection law. The legal system issue is the extent to which jurists, judges, lawyers, etc., have the tools to analyze and bring these cases before judges, and judges have the capacity, or regulators, judges and regulators have the capacity to deal with them. So there's an important point about understanding what actually works and how it can be done to deal with such discrimination. Okay, so let's just have a look at some of the sectors in which discrimination can, through AI systems, can work. Nice picture of a lemon I squeezed into my gin and tonic a few weeks ago to give you an idea of the different sectors. Well, biometrics is one, employment and recruitment, public services, and that was the Siri case, which we may talk about later. The provision of financial services, loans, management of debt, and so on, consumer decisions, consumer choices, consumer offerings, and so on, justice and policing, and I would include within that other related state policies. These are all classic situations in which we know discrimination is occurring. So we discussed how to deal with all of this in regulating for an equal AI, and we put the picture up of it, and you've got the link in your papers. And I'm just going to go very quickly. I'll skip this slide because we've talked through that. But this is a very important slide, I think. I'm just going to talk you through this one before I wrap up. So as national equality bodies, in our report, we said you've got to look at your mandate to see what you can do, your resources. You've got to map the territory and do a legal gap analysis. You've got to think about the information, and you've got to create a multi-stakeholder approach to tackle these issues. And the ways you can do that is through getting information advice, creating codes of practice, carrying out inquiries, offering grants, human rights cooperation, doing investigations and follow-up, and providing legal assistance. And then I'll just remind you, Raja's already put this slide up, but this is going to be so important for you. The key areas that the Commission has identified as being high risk and where focus should be: biometric identification, management of critical infrastructure, that's things like the supply of gas and electricity and so on, education and vocational training, employment rights, access to and enjoyment of essential private services, law enforcement, migration, asylum, border control, administration of justice and democratic processes. And these must be part of your focus. We've just looked at that in the employment context in the UK and done a report for the Trade Unions Congress. And D&I said that we can identify some red lines. Now, this slide we will upload to the website for you, but we think that there are, in fact, now enough information to say that there are red lines where AI systems should not go and which equality bodies should be identifying in each of the areas which we've discussed. So I put the slide up there. We can talk about it later if necessary. Do please stay in touch. There's our website, we tweet, and you can get in touch with us. We've given you the UK telephone number, but you can obviously put 44 in the front and deal with that. Very nice to talk to you all.